the moment before the move. There is a moment that comes before action. It does not announce itself. It does not feel heroic or clear or brave. It often feels quiet, slightly uncomfortable, a little unfinished. Most people imagine action as a sharp turn, a decision made with confidence, a sudden surge of energy that pushes everything forward. But that is not usually how it begins. More often, action starts in a softer place, a place where nothing visible has changed yet, but something internal has shifted just enough to make stillness feel heavier than movement. This moment tends to arrive when waiting no longer feels neutral, when doing nothing starts to require effort, when staying where you are begins to cost more than you expected. You might recognize it as restlessness, or boredom, or a vague irritation that has no clear source. It can show up while scrolling or staring at the ceiling or reorganizing the same drawer for the third time. Nothing is technically wrong, yet something feels slightly out of alignment, like standing in a doorway too long, unsure which room you meant to enter. The strange thing about this moment is that it does not feel like readiness. It feels closer to friction, a gentle resistance between who you are and who you are becoming. And because it lacks drama, it is easy to dismiss, easy to tell yourself that it is nothing, that you just need more rest, more information, more time. Time, of course, is very cooperative. It will keep passing whether you move or not. In this quiet space before action, thoughts often loop. You revisit the same ideas without progressing them. You imagine outcomes without taking steps. You prepare without beginning. Preparation can feel productive, even soothing, but it has a hidden comfort. It allows you to feel close to change without actually changing anything. There is safety in that, no risk, no exposure, no chance of getting it wrong. Yet beneath that safety, there is usually a small tension, a sense that something is being postponed that does not want to wait much longer. This moment is not about pressure. It is about honesty, about noticing that you are already spending energy, just not in the direction you intended. That thinking, avoiding, and circling around the idea has begun to take more effort than a small step would. Action, in this sense, is not an explosion. It is a release. Before the move, there is often a story you tell yourself about timing, about how later will be better, how conditions will improve, how you will feel more capable once something external changes. These stories are rarely lies. They are usually partial truths. Conditions do matter. Timing does matter, but they are often given more weight than they deserve. The moment before action asks a simpler question. What if nothing changes externally? What if this is as good as it gets for starting? That question can feel uncomfortable because it removes excuses without creating urgency. It does not demand greatness. It simply removes the illusion that waiting is free. In this space, doubt tends to speak softly but persistently, not in dramatic warnings, but in practical concerns. What if this leads nowhere? What if it is wasted effort? What if you begin and realize you are not who you thought you were? These doubts are not enemies. They are cautious companions. They are trying to protect you from disappointment, from embarrassment, from the discomfort of being seen in motion rather than admired in potential. Potential is clean. Action is messy. The moment before the move is when you feel the weight of that choice. Remain defined by what you could do, or become shaped by what you actually do. Neither option is wrong, but only one of them leads anywhere new. Interestingly, this moment rarely arrives when life is calm. It often appears during periods of fatigue, distraction, or low energy. When motivation is not available to carry you. When inspiration has gone quiet. That is part of its honesty. It strips away the fantasy version of action and replaces it with something more real. Action that happens only when you feel ready is not action you can rely on. Here, before the move, you begin to sense that action is not a mood. It is a relationship, one that grows stronger through repetition rather than intensity. You might notice a shift in language inside your head. Less dreaming, more noticing. Less imagining the end, more thinking about the beginning. The very first edge of it. The smallest unit of movement that still counts as movement. This is often where resistance becomes loudest. Not because the step is large, but because it is specific. Vague plans can coexist peacefully with fear. Specific actions cannot. They demand a response. So you hover, you pause, you feel the pull of comfort on one side and curiosity on the other. Curiosity is important here, not ambition, not discipline, just curiosity. What would happen if I took one small step, not forever, not perfectly, just once? The moment before the move is where identity starts to loosen. You are no longer only the person who plans, thinks, or intends. You are about to become someone who does, even slightly. That shift can feel surprisingly emotional. There can be grief for the version of yourself that was safe in imagination. There can be relief at finally touching something real. There can be fear that once you begin, you cannot pretend anymore. But there is also something quieter beneath all of that, a sense of alignment, like your internal world and your external behavior are about to match more closely. This is why the moment matters, not because it is dramatic, but because it is honest. It is where you stop negotiating with the future and start cooperating with the present. Nothing visible happens here. No one applauds. No milestone is reached. From the outside, everything looks the same. But internally, a decision is forming that does not rely on excitement or certainty. It relies on acceptance. Acceptance that action does not need permission from confidence, that it does not require a guarantee of success, that it can begin in uncertainty and still be valid. In many ways, this moment is the hardest part. Not the effort itself, but the transition, the shift from thinking about movement to allowing it, from observing yourself to participating. Once the move happens, even imperfectly, the mind adjusts, energy rearranges. Momentum, however small, starts to exist. But before that, there is only you and the choice to remain still or step forward. This chapter lives in that space. The quiet second before motion, the breath held not out of fear, but out of awareness. You are not late here. You are not behind. You are simply standing at the edge of action, noticing that the ground beneath you is solid enough to take a step, and that noticing is already a kind of movement. Why we wait longer than we need to. Waiting rarely feels like a decision. It feels like a pause, a neutral space, a reasonable delay. Most of the time, we do not say to ourselves that we are choosing not to act. We say we are gathering information, resting, letting things settle, being patient. All of these sound responsible, mature even, and sometimes they are. But often, waiting becomes something else entirely, a habit that quietly replaces movement. The interesting part is that waiting usually begins with good intentions. You want to do things well. You want to avoid mistakes. You want to be sure that when you move, it counts. So you slow down, you observe, you prepare, and for a while that feels right. Then time stretches. At some point, the reason for waiting becomes less clear. The original concern fades, but the delay remains. You are no longer waiting for something specific. You are simply waiting. And because there is no clear endpoint, the pause quietly becomes a lifestyle. One reason we wait longer than necessary is that waiting protects identity. As long as something is not started, it cannot fail. It also cannot succeed in a way that changes how you see yourself. Potential remains untouched, clean, intact. Action, on the other hand, reveals things. It exposes limits. It shows where effort is uneven. It forces you to meet reality rather than your imagination of it. That can feel like a loss, even when the outcome is positive. So waiting feels safer, not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. Another reason waiting is so persistent is that it disguises itself as thinking. You replay scenarios. You analyze outcomes. You imagine conversations that have not happened yet. This mental activity creates the impression of progress. Something is happening. Energy is being spent. But thinking without movement has a strange effect. It does not resolve uncertainty. It multiplies it. Each new angle creates another reason to pause, another condition to meet before starting. The mind becomes very good at protecting stillness while convincing you that it is working hard. Waiting also benefits from social approval. No one questions preparation. No one criticizes patience. If anything, restraint is often praised. Acting too soon is framed as reckless. Acting slowly is framed as wise. The problem is that this framing ignores context. It assumes that more time automatically leads to better decisions. Sometimes it does. Often it simply leads to more hesitation. There is also the quiet fear of irreversibility. Starting something can feel like closing other doors, as if action locks you into a path you may later regret. Waiting keeps options open. At least it feels that way. In reality, time closes doors regardless. Opportunities expire. Energy changes. Circumstances shift. The difference is that when doors close while you are waiting, it feels passive, less personal. When doors close because of your actions, it feels like responsibility. So waiting becomes a way to avoid owning outcomes. Not because you do not care, but because you care deeply and do not want to get it wrong. Another subtle reason for delay is the belief that clarity comes first, that once you understand everything, action will naturally follow. This belief is comforting. It suggests that uncertainty is the problem and certainty is the solution. But clarity is often the result of action, not the prerequisite. Many things only make sense once you are inside them. Before that, they remain abstract, flat, incomplete. Waiting for clarity can be like waiting to understand the ocean before stepping into the water. From the shore, you can study it endlessly, depth, temperature, movement. But until you enter, it remains theoretical. There is also an emotional layer to waiting that rarely gets acknowledged. Sometimes waiting is a form of self-protection when you are tired, when life has already asked a lot of you, when the idea of adding another demand feels overwhelming. In those moments, waiting is not avoidance, it is recovery. The difficulty is that rest and avoidance can feel very similar from the inside. Both involve stillness, both involve delay. Only one restores energy. Without noticing the difference, it is easy to rest indefinitely, to tell yourself you are conserving strength while quietly losing momentum. Waiting also thrives on comparison. You look at others who seem further along, more prepared, more confident. Their action appears smoother, more justified. In comparison, your own starting point feels inadequate. So you wait until you feel more like them, until you feel worthy of beginning. But what you are seeing is the middle of their story, not the beginning. Their hesitation, confusion, and awkward first steps are invisible. You compare your behind the scenes with their highlight reel and conclude that you are not ready. This creates a loop where waiting feels like humility, like realism, when in fact, it is often just distance from your own process. There is also a belief that waiting keeps you safe from disappointment. If you do not start, you cannot be let down. You cannot discover that something you wanted does not feel the way you imagined, that the effort is harder than expected, that the reward is quieter than promised. Waiting preserves hope in its purest form, untested, unchallenged. Action introduces complexity. It mixes hope with frustration, progress with setbacks, satisfaction with doubt. That mix can feel emotionally demanding. Waiting feels simpler, even when it is unsatisfying. The cost of waiting is rarely immediate. That is why it is so easy to underestimate. Days pass without consequence, then weeks, then months. Life continues. You function. You adapt. But there is a slow accumulation that happens beneath the surface, a background sense of unfinished business, a subtle erosion of trust in yourself. Each delay reinforces the idea that you do not move until conditions are perfect. Over time, this becomes an identity, someone who thinks deeply, someone who is careful, someone who is almost ready. Almost ready can last a lifetime. The moment you begin to see this is often uncomfortable. Not dramatic, but sobering. You realize that much of the waiting was not required, that some of the conditions you were waiting for were never coming, or were never necessary. This realization is not meant to produce regret. Regret freezes movement just as effectively as fear. It is meant to produce clarity, to see waiting for what it is, not as a flaw, but as a strategy that has outlived its usefulness. You waited because it made sense at the time, because it protected you, because it gave you space. There is no need to judge that. The question is simply whether it still serves you now. Waiting is not the enemy of action. It is part of its rhythm. The problem arises when waiting becomes the default rather than the exception, when it no longer leads toward movement, but replaces it. Understanding why you wait longer than needed is not about forcing yourself forward. It is about removing the illusion that delay is neutral, that it carries no weight. Once you see that waiting is an active choice with real consequences, even gentle ones, something shifts. The pause becomes conscious, the delay becomes intentional, or it dissolves. And in that awareness, action no longer feels like a leap. It feels like a correction, a small adjustment toward alignment, not rushed, not dramatic, just honest. Is overrated. Motivation has a good reputation. It sounds powerful, clean, energizing. It is often described as the spark that starts everything. We are taught, directly or indirectly, to wait for it, to look for the feeling that makes action feel easy, the internal green light that says now is the time. When motivation arrives, we believe movement will follow naturally, almost effortlessly. The problem is that motivation is unreliable, not because it is useless, but because it is misunderstood. Motivation is not a stable force. It is a response. It reacts to progress, meaning, novelty, and reward. It shows up after something has already begun, not before. Expecting it to appear first is like waiting for warmth before lighting a fire. When motivation does appear before action, it is often tied to excitement, a new idea, a fresh plan, a burst of optimism. These moments feel good, but they are short-lived. Once the novelty fades, motivation tends to follow it out the door. This is where many people get stuck. They begin only when they feel motivated, and they stop as soon as they do not. Over time, this creates a pattern where action becomes dependent on mood, progress becomes inconsistent, and the absence of motivation starts to feel like a personal failure. It is not. The truth is that most meaningful action happens without motivation, or more accurately, before motivation arrives. It happens in ordinary moments. Moments where energy is low, clarity is partial, and the feeling of wanting to do the thing is simply not there. In those moments, waiting for motivation becomes another form of delay. It sounds reasonable. Why force yourself when the feeling is missing? Why push when your mind is not aligned? But this reasoning assumes that motivation is a prerequisite, that it must come first. In reality, motivation is more like a byproduct. It follows evidence that something is moving. That effort is creating change, even small change. When you take action without motivation, something subtle happens. You generate proof that you can move even when it is uncomfortable. Proof that effort does not require enthusiasm. This proof quietly reshapes your self-perception. You begin to see yourself as someone who acts regardless of internal weather, someone who does not need perfect conditions to begin. That identity shift is far more powerful than any temporary surge of motivation. There is also a cultural element to this misunderstanding. Motivation is often portrayed as dramatic, music swelling, vision sharpening, a sudden sense of purpose. This makes ordinary action feel insufficient by comparison, but real life does not usually feel cinematic. It feels repetitive, uneventful, quiet. If you wait for motivation that feels inspiring, you may overlook the kind that feels practical. The kind that sounds like, I can do a little of this now, not because I want to, but because it is time. That kind of motivation does not feel like motivation at all. It feels like acceptance. Another issue with motivation is that it can make action conditional. You begin to associate effort with feeling good. When effort does not feel good, you assume something is wrong, either with the task or with you. This creates unnecessary friction. Action becomes emotionally loaded. Each step requires internal negotiation. Am I motivated enough today? Do I feel aligned? Is this the right moment? Meanwhile, action itself is waiting patiently, ready to be taken without commentary. There is a quieter relationship available here, one where action is treated as a behavior, not a performance, something you do because it fits your direction, not because it matches your mood. In this relationship, motivation still exists. It just no longer holds authority. Interestingly, people who rely less on motivation often experience it more frequently, not because they chase it, but because they create the conditions where it naturally appears. Progress generates energy. Completion generates satisfaction. Movement generates clarity. Even small actions can trigger this effect. 5 minutes of effort can change how the next hour feels. One completed task can alter your entire perception of the day. Motivation tends to respond to momentum, not intention. There is also relief in letting motivation off the hook. You stop demanding that your internal state cooperate before you allow yourself to act. You stop treating low energy days as lost days. You stop waiting to feel like a different version of yourself. Instead, you work with who you are today. Tired, distracted, uncertain, still capable of movement. This does not mean forcing yourself aggressively. It means redefining what counts as enough. Action does not need to be intense to be effective. It needs to be repeatable. When motivation is overrated, discipline often gets promoted as its replacement. But discipline is also misunderstood. It is often framed as harshness, as control, as pushing through resistance without compassion. That framing is just another extreme. The alternative is something quieter: reliability, the ability to do small things consistently without emotional drama, to treat action as maintenance rather than achievement. In that frame, action becomes less about proving something and more about staying in motion. You do not ask whether you feel like brushing your teeth. You simply do it, not because of motivation, but because it belongs to your day. Some actions can belong to your life in the same way: writing a paragraph, taking a walk, making a difficult call, starting something imperfectly. They do not require motivation. They require permission, permission to be ordinary, to begin without ceremony. When you stop waiting for motivation, you begin to notice how often it was never truly missing. It was simply quiet, subtle, waiting to be invited by movement. There is also a freedom that comes from acting without emotional alignment. You learn that feelings are not commands, that discomfort does not equal danger, that boredom does not mean futility. This understanding builds resilience, not the dramatic kind, but the steady kind, the kind that allows you to continue even when the inner narrative is uncooperative. Over time, motivation becomes something you appreciate rather than depend on, a welcome companion, not a gatekeeper. When it shows up, it enhances the experience. When it does not, it is no longer an obstacle. This shift changes how you approach beginnings. You stop asking, "Do I feel motivated?" You start asking, "What is the smallest action that keeps me aligned with where I want to go?" That question does not require enthusiasm. It requires honesty, and honesty is often enough. Motivation is not the engine. It is the indicator light. Useful, but not essential. Action is what actually moves you forward. Quietly, imperfectly, repeatedly. Once that becomes clear, waiting for motivation starts to feel unnecessary, almost like waiting for permission that was never required in the first place. Small is not a failure. There is a quiet bias against small beginnings. We rarely say it out loud, but it lives in the background of how we judge progress. Big changes feel respectable. Small ones feel tentative, almost apologetic, as if they are trying not to take up too much space. When something matters to us, we tend to believe it deserves a significant effort, a visible leap, a clear transformation. Anything less can feel like avoidance, or worse, a lack of seriousness. So when the only action available is small, we hesitate. We tell ourselves it does not count, that we should wait until we can do more, until we have the time, energy, or confidence to do it properly. This is where many things quietly stall. Small action is often misunderstood as weak action, but small does not mean insignificant. It means manageable, repeatable, sustainable, and those qualities matter far more than intensity over time. The resistance to small steps usually comes from how they feel, not what they do. They feel unsatisfying. They do not provide a sense of completion. They do not dramatically change how things look. They can feel almost invisible, and because they are invisible, they are easy to dismiss. There is also a fear that small action will expose how far you still have to go. Taking a tiny step can make the distance to your goal feel very real. Big gestures can create the illusion of momentum without revealing scale. Small steps make the journey honest. This honesty can feel uncomfortable. It removes the fantasy of overnight change and replaces it with a slower, more grounded reality, one where progress accumulates quietly rather than announces itself. But this is exactly why small works. Large actions often require conditions that rarely align: time, energy, confidence, clarity. Small actions require far less. They fit into imperfect days. They survive interruptions. They can be done even when motivation is low. Most importantly, small actions lower the emotional cost of starting. They do not demand that you become a different person. They allow you to act as you are. There is a psychological shift that happens when you take a small step, not because of the step itself, but because of what it proves. It proves that movement is possible without drama. That effort does not require heroics. That progress can happen in quiet moments. This proof builds trust. Trust in your ability to follow through. Trust that you can return tomorrow and do it again. That trust compounds. The idea that small is failure often comes from how we measure success. We tend to measure by outcomes rather than behavior. Did it produce a result? Did it move the needle? Did it change something visibly? But behavior is the foundation of all outcomes. Without behavior, nothing changes. And behavior does not need to be large to be effective. It needs to be consistent. Small actions excel at consistency. They also reduce the fear of imperfection. When the step is small, the risk of doing it poorly feels lower. You give yourself permission to be clumsy, to experiment, to adjust. Large actions often carry the weight of expectation. They are supposed to work. They are supposed to justify the effort. This pressure can make them brittle. One setback can feel like a collapse. Small actions are more forgiving. If one day does not go well, the cost is low. You try again. There is no need to dramatize the failure because nothing dramatic was attempted. This is not an argument against ambition. It is an argument for sequencing. Big change is built from many small behaviors that become habits, and habits that become identity. No one wakes up one day and suddenly lives differently. They start doing something slightly differently, often without anyone noticing. Small actions also protect energy. They do not exhaust you. They leave room for recovery. They allow life to continue alongside effort rather than being overwhelmed by it. This matters more than it seems. Burnout rarely comes from doing too little. It comes from doing too much, too intensely, for too long without support. Small steps create a rhythm that can be sustained. They respect your limits rather than challenging them constantly. There is also an emotional humility in small action. You accept that change takes time, that you are learning, that progress does not need to be impressive to be real. This humility can feel like a loss at first, especially if you are used to identifying with big plans and bold intentions. But it also brings relief. You no longer have to perform your effort. You just have to show up. Small is not a failure. It is often the only honest option. When people say they want to do something properly, they often mean perfectly, or completely, or once and for all. Small action disrupts that narrative. It suggests that doing something partially, imperfectly, and repeatedly is not only acceptable, but effective. This can feel counterintuitive, especially in a culture that celebrates breakthroughs and transformations. But breakthroughs are rarely singular events. They are the visible result of long periods of unremarkable effort. The problem is that we tend to compare our small beginnings to other people's finished outcomes. We forget the invisible accumulation that led there. We assume that because their result is large, their effort must have been large at every stage. It rarely is. Small actions are also more adaptable. As you move, you learn. You notice what works and what does not. You adjust direction without having invested too heavily in a single approach. Large actions can lock you in. Small ones keep you flexible. There is a kind of quiet courage in choosing small when you could choose nothing. In taking a step that feels almost too easy and trusting that it matters anyway. This courage does not look impressive. It does not create stories worth telling, but it creates lives that move forward. If you pay attention, you might notice that many of the things you admire in others are built on small, uncelebrated habits. Daily practices, repeated choices, boring consistency. What you are seeing is not the size of their actions, but the length of their commitment. Small steps make commitment possible. They also change how you relate to time. Instead of waiting for a future version of yourself to take over, you begin to act as the person you already are. The gap between intention and behavior shrinks. Over time, small actions stop feeling small, not because they grow in size, but because their effect accumulates. They begin to shape how you spend your days, how you think about yourself, what you expect from your own effort. At that point, the question is no longer whether small is enough. It is whether you are willing to continue. And continuing quietly is often where real change lives. The myth of being ready. Readiness is one of those ideas that sounds reasonable until you look at it closely. It feels responsible, mature, thoughtful. Who would want to start something before being ready? So we wait. We wait to feel confident. We wait to feel calm. We wait to feel certain that this is the right thing, at the right time, in the right way. Readiness becomes a finish line we believe we must cross before we are allowed to begin. The problem is that readiness is not a place you arrive at. It is a story you tell yourself about how starting should feel, and that story is usually shaped by hindsight, not reality. When people talk about being ready, they often mean they want to feel free of doubt, free of fear, free of awkwardness. They want the sense that everything inside them agrees. That rarely happens. Most beginnings feel unsteady, not because something is wrong, but because beginnings disrupt equilibrium. They introduce uncertainty into a system that has learned how to function as it is. The idea that readiness precedes action is comforting because it suggests control. If you can just prepare enough, think enough, wait enough, you can eliminate risk. You can step forward without friction. But friction is not a flaw. It is a signal that something is changing. If you look back at moments in your life when something truly began, a job, a relationship, a creative path, a difficult conversation, they probably did not feel clean. They felt mixed. Excitement tangled with doubt. Curiosity layered with hesitation. You did not feel ready. You felt compelled. Readiness is often assigned retroactively. Once something works out, we say we were ready. Once we survive the discomfort, we reframe it as preparation. But in the moment, it rarely feels that way. The myth of readiness convinces you that hesitation is information, that your uncertainty means you should wait. Sometimes that is true, but often, uncertainty is simply the price of entry. There is also a subtle perfectionism hiding inside readiness, a belief that you should begin from a position of competence, that you should know what you are doing, that you should look like someone who belongs. This belief is heavy. It turns learning into performance. It makes early mistakes feel like evidence of inadequacy rather than part of the process. In reality, readiness often grows through action, not before it. You become ready by doing the thing badly, by discovering what you did not know, by adjusting, by surviving the parts you were afraid of. Waiting for readiness delays that learning. Another reason readiness feels important is because it promises protection from regret. If you wait until you are sure, you believe you will avoid wrong turns, that you will choose correctly, that you will not waste time. But waiting does not guarantee better decisions. It only guarantees fewer experiences. Clarity comes from contact, from being inside something, not observing it from a distance. Many decisions cannot be evaluated accurately in advance. They reveal their truth only after you step into them. The desire to be ready is often the desire to skip vulnerability, to avoid the feeling of being new, of being seen trying, of not knowing the answers yet. That vulnerability is uncomfortable because it touches identity. You are no longer the person who might do the thing. You are the person who is doing it. That shift can feel exposing. So readiness becomes a shield, a way to postpone exposure while telling yourself you are being thoughtful. There is also a cultural expectation wrapped up in readiness. We celebrate confidence. We admire people who appear decisive and sure. We rarely celebrate hesitation or uncertainty, even though they are far more common at the start of anything real. This creates pressure to look ready before you feel ready. And if you cannot look ready, you wait until you think you can. The truth is, readiness is not a feeling you wait for. It is a capacity you build. You build it by tolerating discomfort, by acting while unsure, by learning to stay present when things feel unfinished, by discovering that uncertainty does not collapse you. Each time you act without readiness, something important happens. Your tolerance expands. The next time, the same level of uncertainty feels less threatening. Not because the risk is gone, but because you know you can handle it. This is how confidence actually forms. Not from certainty, but from repeated exposure to uncertainty without catastrophe. The myth of readiness also hides the fact that some things can never be fully prepared for. You can read about them, think about them, plan for them, but the experience itself will always contain elements you could not predict. Waiting for readiness in those cases is like waiting for the weather to be permanently favorable before stepping outside. There is another quiet cost to waiting. While you are preparing to begin, you are also practicing not beginning. That practice matters. Habits form whether you notice them or not. The habit of delay strengthens with use. Over time, readiness starts to feel even further away. Not because you are less capable, but because the distance between intention and action has grown. The gap feels intimidating. Crossing it feels heavier. At that point, readiness becomes less about preparation and more about permission. Permission to be imperfect. permission to change your mind later, permission to begin without a clear ending. This permission is rarely granted by external circumstances. It is an internal decision. Being ready does not mean you feel confident. It means you are willing. Willing to be a beginner. Willing to revise. Willing to be uncomfortable without assuming something has gone wrong. There is also a quiet honesty in admitting that you will never feel fully ready, that some uncertainty will always be present, that waiting for its disappearance is a form of avoidance, not wisdom. Once you accept that, something loosens. You stop monitoring your internal state so closely. You stop asking whether you feel right. You start asking whether this step makes sense given where you are. Sense does not require certainty. It requires alignment. Many people confuse readiness with alignment. They think that if something is right, it should feel easy to start. But alignment can feel challenging. It can ask things of you. It can stretch you. Discomfort does not mean misalignment. It often means growth. The moment you stop waiting to be ready, action changes character. It becomes quieter, less dramatic, less loaded. You are no longer trying to arrive as someone else. You are arriving as yourself. That shift removes a great deal of pressure. You do not have to prove anything. You do not have to justify the start. You simply begin where you are. Readiness in this frame becomes irrelevant. What matters is responsiveness, the ability to respond to the moment you are in rather than the moment you wish you were in. And responsiveness is available now. Not someday, not after one more round of preparation. Now. The myth of being ready dissolves when you see it for what it is, a comforting idea that promises safety but quietly delays life. You do not become ready and then act. You act, and through acting, you discover that you were ready enough all along. Discomfort as a compass. Discomfort has a bad reputation. We are taught to interpret it as a warning, a sign that something is wrong, something to avoid, fix, or numb as quickly as possible. So when discomfort appears around action, we often take it as evidence that we should stop, that we are pushing too hard, that this is not the right path. But discomfort is not always a signal to retreat. Sometimes it is a signal that you are moving in a meaningful direction. This is difficult to accept because discomfort feels similar whether it comes from danger or growth. The body does not always distinguish between the two. Increased heart rate, tension, restlessness, a desire to escape. These sensations show up in many contexts. Learning to read discomfort requires nuance. It requires separating harm from unfamiliarity. Much of what we avoid is not actually harmful. It is simply new, or exposing, or emotionally demanding in ways we are not used to. The discomfort here is not a threat. It is a boundary being gently expanded. The problem is that we often treat all discomfort as equal. We respond to it with the same strategy. Avoidance. Avoidance works well in the short term. It reduces sensation. It restores equilibrium. But it also removes information. Discomfort carries data. When you step away too quickly, you miss what it was trying to show you. There is a particular kind of discomfort that appears when you are close to something important. It does not feel panicked. It feels tight, focused, almost precise. It draws attention rather than scattering it. This discomfort often shows up right before action, before speaking honestly, before starting something new, before committing to a direction that cannot be undone easily. It asks a question rather than issuing a command. Can you stay here a little longer? Staying does not mean forcing yourself through pain. It means observing, noticing what exactly feels uncomfortable, where it lives in the body, what thoughts accompany it. Often the discomfort is not about the task itself. It is about what the task represents: visibility, responsibility, change in identity. When you take action, you risk being seen differently by others and by yourself. Discomfort arises to mark that threshold. If you step back, the discomfort fades, but so does the opportunity. Using discomfort as a compass does not mean chasing pain. It means noticing patterns. Where does discomfort repeatedly appear? What kinds of actions consistently trigger it? You may notice that the same types of situations make you uneasy. Speaking up, setting boundaries, beginning something without permission, ending something that no longer fits. These patterns are not random. They point toward edges of growth. There is also a distinction between discomfort that sharpens and discomfort that drains. Some discomfort leaves you feeling more present, even if tense. Other discomfort leaves you depleted, foggy, or shut down. The first often signals alignment with something that matters. The second often signals misalignment or overload. Learning this distinction takes time. It cannot be learned intellectually. It is learned through exposure and reflection, through staying long enough to see what happens next. Avoidance prevents this learning. Another reason discomfort is misunderstood is because we expect progress to feel encouraging. We expect to feel lighter as we move forward. Sometimes that happens. Often, the opposite happens first. Progress can feel heavy before it feels light. It can increase responsibility before it increases freedom. It can introduce complexity before clarity. Discomfort marks that transition. There is also a cultural narrative that tells us to trust our feelings. This is good advice, up to a point. But feelings are context sensitive. They are shaped by habit. If your nervous system is accustomed to stillness, movement will feel uncomfortable regardless of its value. Trusting feelings without questioning their origin can lead you to protect patterns that no longer serve you. Discomfort does not mean you are wrong. It often means you are early. When you interpret discomfort as danger, you create a very small life, one where you only move when it feels easy. But ease is often the result of familiarity, not correctness. Everything that is familiar was once uncomfortable. This does not mean that all discomfort is good. Some discomfort is a signal to slow down, to rest, to seek support, to change course. The skill is discernment. Discomfort as a compass works when paired with curiosity. Instead of asking, "How do I make this stop?" you ask, "What is this pointing toward?" That question changes your relationship with sensation. Discomfort becomes informative rather than threatening. You may notice that when you lean slightly into certain discomforts, they change. They soften. They become manageable. Not because they disappear, but because your capacity to hold them increases. This is how tolerance grows. With increased tolerance comes choice. You are no longer automatically controlled by sensation. You can decide how to respond. This does not require courage in the dramatic sense. It requires patience, the willingness to stay present with an experience long enough to understand it. Many people confuse comfort with safety. But comfort is simply the absence of challenge. Safety is the absence of harm. Growth often lives in the space between the two. Discomfort signals that you have entered that space. When you begin to see discomfort this way, action becomes less emotionally charged. You stop interpreting unease as a verdict. You start treating it as context. This shift reduces self-judgment. Instead of asking why something feels hard, you accept that it feels hard because it matters. There is also a subtle empowerment in this perspective. Discomfort no longer controls you. It informs you. It becomes a collaborator rather than an obstacle. You do not need to eliminate discomfort to move forward. You need to understand it. The moment you stop running from discomfort, it loses some of its intensity. It no longer has to shout to get your attention. This does not mean you seek it out. It means you stop letting it dictate your limits. Over time, you may notice that the things that once made you uncomfortable no longer do, not because they disappeared, but because you have changed. Your compass recalibrates. Discomfort stops being a wall and starts being a signpost. And once you learn how to read it, you are less likely to get lost. Time is already passing. Time has a way of feeling abstract until it doesn't. Until a date arrives sooner than expected. Until something ends quietly. Until you notice that a thought you have been having for years is still only a thought. Most of the time feels neutral. It moves in the background, steady and polite. It does not rush you. It does not demand decisions. It simply keeps going. This is why waiting can feel harmless. When nothing dramatic happens as a result of delay, it is easy to assume that nothing is being lost. Days pass, life continues. You adapt. But time is not paused while you wait. It is being spent. The uncomfortable truth is that action and inaction both cost time. The difference is visibility. Action makes the cost obvious. Inaction hides it behind routine. When you take action, you feel the effort. You notice the hours spent. You are aware of the investment. When you do not act, the cost is spread thinly across days and weeks. It feels like nothing until it adds up to something you cannot ignore. This is not meant to create urgency. Urgency creates panic, not clarity. This is about accuracy, about seeing time as it is, not as it feels. Time does not wait for certainty. It does not wait for confidence. It does not wait for you to feel ready. It moves with or without your participation. Once you really see this, the question changes. It is no longer whether you should act now or later. It is what you are choosing to spend time on either way. Waiting is not free. It consumes attention. It occupies mental space. It creates low-level tension. The thing you are not doing follows you around quietly. You think about it while doing other things. It shows up in moments of stillness. It hums in the background. This ongoing presence is also time spent. Many people imagine that if they do not act, they are conserving time. In reality, they are often dispersing it, losing it in fragments too small to notice individually. Action gathers time. It concentrates it. Even a short period of focused effort can resolve something that has lingered for months. There is also a psychological cost to postponement. When you delay something that matters, you train yourself to live with internal misalignment. You get used to the gap between intention and behavior. At first, the gap feels uncomfortable. Over time, it becomes familiar. Familiar does not mean healthy. It means tolerated. This tolerance is dangerous, not because it causes immediate harm, but because it normalizes dissatisfaction. You stop expecting follow-through from yourself. You adjust your self-image to match your behavior rather than your values. Time plays a role in this adjustment. The longer something is delayed, the harder it becomes to imagine starting. Not because the task changes, but because the story around it grows heavier. You are no longer just starting the thing. You are starting it late, or after a long pause, or after telling yourself for years that you would. That added weight is created by time, not by the task itself. The idea that there will be more time later is both comforting and misleading. There may be more time, but it will not be the same time. Energy changes. Priorities shift. Responsibilities accumulate. What feels manageable now may feel unrealistic later. Not because you are weaker, but because life is fuller. This does not mean you should rush. It means you should be honest about conditions. There is a quiet window that exists for many actions, a period where the effort required is reasonable, where the cost of starting is lower than it will be later. That window does not announce itself. It simply exists. Often, you realize it only after it is closed. Time also affects perception. The longer you wait, the more monumental the action feels. Not because it is, but because you have been carrying it mentally for so long. The anticipation inflates it. Action deflates things. Waiting inflates them. This is why starting often feels easier than expected once you finally do. The fear belonged to the waiting, not the doing. When you recognize that time is already passing, something subtle shifts. You stop treating the present as a holding area. You stop assuming that later is more real than now. Now is where time actually exists. There is also a false moral neutrality assigned to waiting. We tend to see action as a choice and inaction as the absence of choice. But inaction is a choice. It is a decision to let things continue as they are. Sometimes that is the right decision. Stability has value. Rest has value. Not everything needs to change. The problem arises when inaction is unexamined, when it happens by default rather than by intention. Choosing not to act can be wise. Drifting into not acting rarely is. Time responds differently to intention. When you consciously choose to wait, you often use the time differently. You rest fully. You prepare deliberately. You pay attention. When you unconsciously wait, time dissolves. It slips through routines. It leaves you with the feeling that you are busy but not moving. Seeing time clearly does not require pressure. It requires respect. Respect for the fact that this day will not repeat. That the version of you who exists now is temporary. That circumstances are always in motion, even when you are still. Action is one way of honoring that reality. Not because it guarantees results, but because it acknowledges that time matters. You do not need to act on everything. But the things that return to your attention again and again are worth noticing. They persist because they are unresolved. They are asking for engagement. Time will continue whether you answer or not. The only question is whether you want to be part of what happens while it does. This is not about doing more. It is about doing what aligns with how you want time to feel when you look back. When time is spent intentionally, even imperfect action feels meaningful. When time is spent avoiding, even rest feels uneasy. Time is already passing. That is not a threat, it is a fact. And facts, when acknowledged, have a way of clarifying what actually matters. The energy of beginning. There is a particular kind of energy that appears at the start of something. It is not excitement, though it can look like it from a distance. It is quieter, less polished, slightly unstable. Beginning does not usually feel powerful. It feels awkward. You are not yet in rhythm. You are thinking about each step instead of moving naturally. There is effort without flow. This is why beginnings are often avoided. They demand attention without offering reward. They ask for energy before giving any back. But something interesting happens once you cross that threshold. Once you begin, even imperfectly, the quality of your energy changes. Before beginning, energy is scattered. It leaks into thinking, doubting, imagining, postponing. You feel tired without having done anything because the effort is diffuse. After beginning, energy gathers. It does not always increase, but it concentrates. It has direction. Even a small action can pull your attention into the present moment in a way that waiting never does. This is the energy of beginning. Focused, slightly tense, alive. Many people believe they need energy in order to start. In reality, starting is often what creates usable energy. Not physical stamina, necessarily, but mental coherence. When you begin, you stop negotiating. You stop revisiting the same questions. You move from possibility into reality. That shift alone reduces cognitive load. There is relief in no longer deciding. The first moments of beginning can feel heavy because you are carrying uncertainty forward with you. You have not yet seen results. You do not yet know if this will work. You are acting without reassurance. But this is also where honesty enters. You are no longer dealing with imaginary futures. You are dealing with what is actually happening. Reality, even when imperfect, is easier to work with than speculation. The energy of beginning is fragile. It does not like to be observed too closely. If you pause to evaluate how well you are doing, it can collapse. If you compare yourself to an imagined ideal, it can drain away. It grows best when left alone to find its rhythm. This is why early stages benefit from privacy. Not secrecy, but reduced commentary. Too much reflection too soon interrupts momentum. Beginning wants simplicity. One task, one step, one direction. There is also a physical component to this energy. Action engages the body. Even small movements shift physiology. Posture changes. Breathing changes. The nervous system registers that something is happening. Waiting keeps the body static. Beginning wakes it up. This does not mean beginning always feels good. It can feel frustrating, slow, disorganized, but beneath those sensations there is engagement. Engagement is different from motivation. Motivation is emotional. Engagement is relational. You are in contact with the task, responding to it, adjusting. Once engagement exists, energy becomes renewable, not endlessly, but sufficiently. This is why beginnings often feel harder than continuation. Once you are in motion, the work carries you. Habits form. Familiarity reduces friction. But the first step has no momentum behind it. It must be generated manually. People often underestimate this. They expect the beginning to feel like the middle. When it does not, they assume something is wrong. Nothing is wrong. This is simply how beginnings feel. There is also vulnerability in beginning. You are unskilled, unproven. You are visible to yourself in a new way. This visibility can create self-consciousness. Self-consciousness consumes energy. The way through this is not confidence. It is repetition. Repetition shifts attention from self to task, from performance to process. As repetition builds, the energy of beginning transforms into the energy of continuation. Less intense, more stable. Less exciting, more reliable. But without the initial beginning, that transition never happens. Another misunderstanding is that beginning commits you forever, that once you start, you must continue. This belief adds unnecessary pressure. Beginning is not a contract. It is an experiment. It gives you information. You can adjust, you can stop, you can change direction, but you cannot learn what something requires without beginning. The energy that comes from beginning is not about certainty. It is about contact. You touch the thing you have been thinking about from a distance. That contact is grounding. It pulls you out of abstraction. Many people are surprised by how ordinary beginning feels once they do it. The drama dissolves. The task becomes just a task. This ordinariness is part of its power. The mind tends to inflate what is unknown. Beginning deflates it. There is also a subtle pride that emerges from beginning, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that comes from alignment. You did what you said you would do, even a little. This pride is stabilizing. It strengthens self-trust. Self-trust is a source of energy that does not depend on mood. Each time you begin, you reinforce the belief that you are someone who can start. That belief matters more than the outcome of any single effort. The energy of beginning also has a time-sensitive quality. It responds to immediacy. Long delays weaken it. Over-planning suffocates it. This is why beginnings often benefit from quick execution, not rushed, but prompt. When the impulse appears, acting soon preserves its energy. Waiting too long introduces friction. Doubt grows. Alternatives multiply. The initial spark dims. This does not mean you must act impulsively. It means that beginnings prefer movement over contemplation. Once movement exists, contemplation becomes useful. You can reflect from within the process rather than outside it. The paradox is that beginning often feels like a loss of control, but it actually increases agency. You are no longer at the mercy of thought loops. You are shaping reality, however modestly. That shaping produces feedback. Feedback creates learning. Learning creates confidence. Confidence that is earned this way is quiet and durable. The energy of beginning does not shout, it hums. It asks to be used before it fades. Not dramatically, just gently. One step, taken while it is still available. And once that step is taken, the question changes. It is no longer whether you can begin. It is how you will continue. Letting go of the perfect outcome. Perfection has a way of hiding inside good intentions. You want to do something well. You want it to matter. You want the effort to be worth the cost. So you imagine an outcome that justifies everything. This imagined outcome becomes a reference point, a silent standard. You do not say it out loud, but it sits in the background of every decision. If the result cannot reach that standard, the effort feels questionable. Perfection rarely announces itself as perfection. It arrives dressed as care, as pride, as wanting to do justice to the idea. But over time, it begins to narrow what feels acceptable. Only certain paths feel valid. Only certain results feel satisfying. Anything else feels like settling. This is where progress quietly slows. The perfect outcome is compelling because it promises resolution. If things turn out just right, all the effort will make sense. Doubt will be erased. Uncertainty will disappear. The story will feel complete. The problem is that real outcomes are rarely clean. They are mixed. They contain success and disappointment at the same time. They do not align perfectly with expectations. When you hold tightly to a perfect outcome, you make it harder to accept the imperfect reality that arrives. This does not mean lowering standards. It means releasing the idea that there is one correct way for things to turn out. Perfectionism often focuses on the end rather than the process. You become attached to how things should look once they are finished. This attachment influences how you act now. You hesitate to take steps that might lead somewhere else. You avoid paths that do not guarantee the desired result. You wait for signs that you are on the right track before committing fully. In doing so, you limit exploration. You reduce flexibility. You narrow possibility. The irony is that many of the outcomes people later value most were not the ones they originally aimed for. They emerged unexpectedly, through detours and adjustments. Letting go of the perfect outcome does not mean abandoning direction. It means loosening your grip on specifics, allowing the process to inform the destination. This can feel risky. Without a clear picture of success, how do you know if you're doing the right thing? The answer is that you know by how you engage, by whether the action feels aligned with your values, by whether you are learning, by whether you are willing to continue. Outcomes are only one form of feedback. Experience is another. When you let go of the perfect outcome, you reduce fear, not because risk disappears, but because failure is no longer defined as deviation from a single ideal. Failure becomes information. This shift changes how you respond to setbacks. Instead of interpreting them as proof that you chose wrong, you see them as part of the landscape, something to navigate rather than avoid. There is also relief in releasing the need for things to turn out a certain way. You stop monitoring every step for signs of success. You stop evaluating your worth based on results. You become more present. Perfectionism often pulls attention into the future. You are constantly checking whether what you are doing now will produce the desired end. This future focus can make the present feel like an obstacle rather than a place to inhabit. Letting go of the perfect outcome brings attention back to the moment, to the task in front of you, to what you can actually influence. This is not resignation, it is realism. You can control effort, not outcome. You can shape direction, not guarantee arrival. Holding this distinction reduces emotional volatility. You are less thrown by external responses, less dependent on validation. This does not mean outcomes stop mattering. It means they stop being the sole measure of value. There is also a quiet creativity that emerges when perfection loosens. You allow yourself to try things that might not work, to explore without a fixed endpoint. This exploration can lead to outcomes that are more interesting than anything you could have planned. The perfect outcome often reflects a simplified version of reality. It assumes linear progress, clear feedback, predictable response. Real processes are rarely linear. They loop, they pause, they change shape. Letting go of perfection allows you to move with this complexity rather than fighting it. Another cost of the perfect outcome is that it can turn beginnings into tests. Each action feels like it must prove something, must justify the decision to start. This pressure makes effort heavy. It drains enjoyment. It increases self-consciousness. When you release the need for a perfect ending, beginnings become lighter. You are allowed to be provisional, to say, this is just a start. We will see where it goes. That openness creates resilience. You are less likely to quit at the first sign of misalignment because misalignment is expected. The perfect outcome also encourages comparison. You measure your progress against idealized versions of others' success. You assume their outcome was intentional, and yours should be too. But most success stories are edited. The uncertainty, confusion, and compromise are removed. What remains looks deliberate. Letting go of the perfect outcome frees you from this comparison. You stop asking whether your path looks right and start asking whether it feels workable. There is also a subtle humility in this release. You acknowledge that you do not know exactly how things should turn out. That reality is more complex than your plans. This humility is not weakness, it is adaptability. Adaptability allows you to respond to what emerges rather than forcing what you imagined. Over time, you may notice that your relationship with success changes. You become less interested in final results and more interested in process quality, in how you spend your time, in whether your effort feels honest. This does not make you less ambitious. It makes ambition less brittle. When outcomes are imperfect, you are not crushed. When they are better than expected, you are pleasantly surprised rather than attached. This emotional flexibility supports longevity. You are more likely to continue when the journey is not tied to a single imagined destination. Letting go of the perfect outcome is not a single decision. It is a practice. Each time you notice yourself tightening around how things should be, you soften. You return to what you can do now. You trust that direction can emerge through movement. The future remains unknown. That does not change. What changes is your relationship to that uncertainty. Instead of trying to control it, you walk with it. And in doing so, you allow outcomes to be real. Not perfect, but meaningful in ways that only reality can provide. Consistency without drama. Consistency is often presented as a grand achievement, something earned through discipline, grit, or relentless willpower. It is framed as a battle you either win or lose. This framing makes consistency feel heavy before you even begin. It suggests effort without relief, repetition without reward, a long stretch of forcing yourself to do things you would rather avoid. No wonder many people resist it. But consistency does not need to be dramatic. In fact, drama is usually what breaks it. Dramatic consistency relies on emotion, on being inspired, on making declarations, on pushing hard until something gives. That something is usually you. Quiet consistency looks different. It is unremarkable. It fits into life rather than competing with it. It does not demand that every day be productive or focused. It only asks that you return. Returning is easier than sustaining intensity. The mistake many people make is believing that consistency requires the same level of effort each time, that if you cannot give your best, you should not show up at all. This all or nothing thinking turns normal fluctuations into reasons to stop. Life is not stable enough to support perfect consistency. Energy varies, attention shifts, circumstances change. A system that requires constant peak performance will fail quickly. Consistency that survives real life must be flexible. This flexibility does not mean lowering commitment. It means adjusting expectations. On some days, showing up means making progress. On other days, it means maintaining contact. Maintenance matters more than it seems. Maintenance keeps habits alive during difficult periods. It preserves identity. You remain someone who does the thing, even when you do very little of it. This continuity is powerful. It prevents the psychological reset that comes with quitting and restarting. Restarting always feels heavier than continuing, even at a minimal level. Consistency without drama also reduces self-judgment. When effort is treated as a normal part of life rather than a test of character, missing a day does not become a moral failure. You do not need to punish yourself to continue. You simply resume. This attitude keeps momentum intact. Another reason drama undermines consistency is that it inflates expectations. When you approach a habit with intensity, you expect visible results quickly. When those results do not appear, disappointment follows. Disappointment drains motivation. Quiet consistency expects little and delivers gradually. It does not promise transformation. It promises presence. Presence is easier to sustain. There is also a subtle ego element in dramatic consistency. Big efforts feel impressive. They create stories. They invite recognition, even if only from yourself. Small, repeated actions feel boring. They do not generate narrative. They do not signal progress loudly. But boredom is not an enemy of consistency. It is often a sign that something has integrated. When an action becomes boring, it means it no longer requires negotiation. It has found a place in your life. Consistency thrives in boredom. The goal is not to feel motivated each time. It is to remove the need for motivation. This happens when actions become default, when they are no longer decisions but routines. Routines do not require drama. They require structure. Structure provides cues: time, location, sequence. These cues reduce friction. They tell the body and mind what comes next without requiring emotional buy-in. Consistency supported by structure is resilient. Even when you are tired, distracted, or uninspired, the structure carries you forward. This does not mean becoming rigid. Structure can adapt. It can shrink or expand, but it maintains a recognizable shape. Drama, on the other hand, thrives on novelty. It needs fresh energy to sustain itself. Once novelty fades, effort collapses. Consistency that depends on novelty will always be fragile. Another misunderstanding is that consistency must look the same from the outside, that if your effort is not visible, it does not count. But much of consistency is invisible. It happens in private moments, in small choices, in the decision to return rather than quit. This invisibility is part of its strength. You are not performing, you are practicing. Practice does not need an audience. Consistency without drama also protects you from burnout. When effort is spread evenly over time, it does not accumulate into exhaustion. It becomes part of your rhythm. Burnout often comes from oscillation, periods of intense effort followed by collapse. This cycle feels productive but is unstable. Quiet consistency avoids extremes. It favors moderation. Moderation is not exciting, but it lasts. There is also a deep trust built through consistent return. Each time you show up briefly, you reinforce the belief that you are reliable to yourself. This self-trust matters more than motivation. When you trust yourself to return, you are less anxious about pauses. You know they are temporary. This reduces pressure. Pressure is one of the main enemies of consistency. Pressure creates resistance. Resistance creates avoidance. Avoidance breaks consistency. Removing drama removes pressure. Consistency becomes a background process rather than a central struggle. It runs quietly, supporting other parts of life. Over time, the effects accumulate, not in dramatic leaps, but in subtle shifts. Skills improve. Understanding deepens. Identity solidifies. These changes are often noticed only in retrospect. People often ask how long it takes to see results from consistency. The honest answer is that it varies. But the more important question is how long it takes for consistency to feel normal. When it feels normal, It no longer requires effort to maintain. It is simply how you live. This normalcy is not the absence of challenge. Challenges still appear, but they are navigated within an established pattern. Consistency without drama also changes how you view setbacks. A setback is no longer a collapse. It is a deviation, something to correct, not catastrophize. This perspective keeps you engaged. You do not need to be intense to be consistent. You need to be kind. Kind enough to allow imperfection. Kind enough to keep going. Drama demands proof. Consistency requires patience. When you remove the need for things to feel important or impressive, you create space for things to simply work, and things that work quietly tend to last. When action changes, action has a subtle way of reshaping identity. Not suddenly, not dramatically, often without permission. We tend to think that we act because of who we are, that behavior follows identity. But just as often, identity follows behavior. Quietly, gradually, almost unnoticed. At first, action feels external, something you do, a task you perform. You might even feel like an imposter while doing it, as if the behavior belongs to a future version of you rather than the present one. This feeling is common. It does not mean the action is wrong. It means identity has not caught up yet. Identity moves slowly. It prefers evidence. It updates itself based on repeated behavior, not intention. Each time you act, you offer a small piece of evidence about who you are. One action is rarely convincing, but many actions repeated over time are persuasive. This is how change actually happens. You do not wake up one morning as a different person. You wake up having done something differently enough times that it now feels natural. At the beginning, effort is conscious. You remind yourself. You push slightly. You choose. Over time, the same behavior requires less negotiation. It becomes expected, normal. This shift is easy to miss because it does not announce itself. There is no clear moment where you say, "Now I am this kind of person." Instead, you notice it indirectly. You realize you no longer argue with yourself about starting, or that certain decisions feel obvious. That is identity adjusting. This process can feel unsettling because it happens without ceremony. You might look back and realize that something important changed while you were not paying attention, that you are no longer the person who hesitated in the same way. Action does not ask for your permission to do this. It simply accumulates. There is also a loss involved in this change. When identity shifts, certain stories about yourself no longer apply. You may no longer be the person who only plans, or the person who waits, or the person who avoids certain risks. Letting go of those identities can feel strange, even uncomfortable. They were familiar. They explained things. They protected you. Action quietly removes those explanations. You cannot say you are someone who wants to start, but never does, because now you do start, even imperfectly. This can create a brief sense of disorientation. If you are not who you were, who are you becoming? The answer is not fixed. Identity continues to evolve as behavior evolves. There is no final version to arrive at. This fluidity is often misunderstood. People fear that changing behavior means losing authenticity, becoming someone artificial or forced. But authenticity is not about remaining static. It is about alignment. When action aligns more closely with values, identity feels more real, not less. The discomfort that sometimes appears during this transition is not a sign of inauthenticity. It is the feeling of growth. There is also an unexpected confidence that emerges from action, not the loud kind, the grounded kind. It does not come from believing in yourself. It comes from trusting yourself. Trust is built through follow-through. Each time you act despite uncertainty, you demonstrate reliability, not perfection. Reliability. You show yourself that you can respond rather than retreat. This trust changes how you relate to future challenges. You do not assume ease, but you assume capability. You know that even if things are difficult, you will engage. That assumption is powerful. Action also changes how you experience time. When you act consistently, days feel fuller, even if you do less. There is a sense of continuity, of narrative. Things connect. Waiting fragments time. Action organizes it. This organization supports identity. You see yourself as someone with direction, even if that direction is flexible. Another subtle change is how you handle fear. Fear does not disappear with action, but it becomes familiar, predictable, Less authoritative. You learn that fear often appears at the same moments: before starting, before speaking, before committing. You stop interpreting its presence as a signal to stop. Fear becomes part of the environment rather than the driver. This changes self-perception. You are no longer someone who avoids fear. You are someone who moves with it. Action also reshapes expectations. You become less idealistic about outcomes and more interested in process. You understand that progress is uneven, that effort does not guarantee results. This realism reduces disappointment. You stop taking setbacks personally. They are part of the landscape, not a verdict. Identity shifts accordingly. You see yourself as adaptable rather than fragile. There is also a quiet pride that grows, not pride in achievements, but pride in participation. You are in your life rather than watching it. This pride does not need reinforcement. It is self-sustaining. Interestingly, action can also reveal what no longer fits. Once you are in motion, you notice misalignment more clearly. Certain paths feel heavy. Certain efforts drain rather than energize. This clarity is not available from stillness. It comes from contrast. Action gives you reference points. As identity changes, desires often change too. Things that once seemed important lose urgency. Things that once felt intimidating become ordinary. This evolution is not something to manage. It happens naturally as behavior accumulates. Trying to control identity directly is exhausting. Letting action shape it is efficient. There is a temptation to wait until you feel like the person who would do the thing, but that person is created by doing the thing. Identity is not a prerequisite. It is a result. This does not mean you lose choice. You still decide what actions to repeat. Those decisions shape who you become. But once the pattern is set, identity follows. This understanding removes pressure. You do not need to feel transformed to continue. You simply need to keep showing up. Over time, the distance between who you think you are and what you do shrinks. That alignment is stabilizing. It reduces internal conflict. You spend less energy negotiating with yourself. Life feels simpler. When action changes you, it does so quietly, without announcements, without guarantees. One day, you notice that the thing that once felt impossible is now just part of your routine, and you realize that you did not become someone else. You became more yourself. Staying in motion. There's a quiet misunderstanding about endings. We imagine them as conclusions, points where effort stops and clarity settles in, where the work is done and something stable takes its place. But most meaningful change does not end that way. It does not resolve into a final state. It continues, softer and less noticeable than the beginning. Staying in motion is not about constant effort. It is about continuity, about remaining engaged with your life rather than returning to the habit of waiting. After action becomes familiar, a new challenge appears. Not starting, but continuing without intensity, without novelty, without the emotional charge that carried you through the early stages. This is where many people drift. Not because they fail, but because they assume the work is finished, or because they expect motion to always feel purposeful and clear. In reality, motion often becomes subtle, almost boring. And that is not a problem. That is integration. When something integrates into your life, it stops demanding attention. You do it without thinking too much about it. You adjust without questioning your direction every day. This is what staying in motion actually looks like. Not acceleration, not constant improvement, just presence. Presence allows you to notice when adjustments are needed, when rest is required, when direction needs to shift slightly. Motion does not mean rigidity. It means responsiveness. One of the fears people have about staying in motion is that it will become exhausting, that they will never be allowed to stop, that momentum will turn into obligation. This fear comes from confusing motion with pressure. Pressure pushes, motion flows. When you are staying in motion, you are not forcing yourself forward. You are simply not stepping out of the process entirely. You remain in relationship with what you are doing. There are days when motion looks like effort. There are days when it looks like maintenance. And there are days when it looks like rest that is chosen rather than avoided. All of these count. Stopping completely is different from pausing. A pause has intention. It is connected to what comes next. Stopping is often a retreat from engagement. Staying in motion allows for pauses without collapse. Another misunderstanding is that staying in motion requires a clear long-term plan, that you must know where you are headed in order to continue, but motion itself creates clarity. Direction emerges through movement. Adjustments happen because you are inside the process, not outside of it. When you stop, clarity fades. You return to abstraction, to speculation, to overthinking. Motion grounds you in reality. This does not mean you never question your path. Questioning is part of motion, but questioning happens alongside action, not instead of it. You reflect while moving. There is also a gentler relationship with time that develops here. You stop measuring progress obsessively. You stop asking whether you are ahead or behind. Those questions lose relevance. You begin to measure differently, by how aligned you feel, by how sustainable your pace is, by whether your days feel coherent. This shift reduces anxiety. Time becomes something you inhabit, rather than race against. Staying in motion also means accepting that some things will be unfinished for a long time, that not everything resolves neatly, that some efforts remain ongoing. This acceptance can feel uncomfortable if you are used to closure, but it also brings freedom. You no longer need to tie your sense of self to completion. You are allowed to be in process. Being in process is not a temporary state. It is how life actually works. The idea of final arrival is comforting but unrealistic. Once you accept this, the pressure to optimize every step eases. You are not trying to get somewhere as fast as possible. You are trying to move in a way you can sustain. Sustainability becomes the quiet measure of success. This does not mean settling. It means choosing a pace that allows for longevity, that respects your limits, that adapts as circumstances change. Staying in motion also requires humility. You accept that you will make wrong turns, that you will need to correct course, that you will outgrow certain paths. Correction is not failure. It is evidence that you are paying attention. When you are in motion, correction is easier. You are already moving. Adjusting direction is a small shift rather than a restart. Restarts are heavy. Adjustments are light. This is one of the hidden benefits of staying engaged. You do not need dramatic resets. You make small changes as you go. Over time, this builds confidence. Not confidence that everything will work out, but confidence that you can respond when it does not. Response replaces control. Control is exhausting. Response is flexible. Staying in motion also changes how you relate to yourself. You stop evaluating your worth based on output. You stop using productivity as a measure of value. Instead, you value participation, showing up, remaining in dialogue with your own life. This perspective is grounding. It reduces the emotional highs and lows that come from attaching identity to results. You are not what you produce. You are how you engage. Engagement can be quiet, it can be imperfect, it can be interrupted. As long as you return, motion continues. There will be times when you slow down, times when life demands attention elsewhere, times when energy is low. Staying in motion during those times may mean doing very little. That is still motion. The mistake is thinking that slow equals stopped. Slow is often exactly what is needed. When you remove urgency, you allow rhythm to develop. Rhythm supports consistency. Consistency supports identity. Identity supports direction. This chain is fragile if forced. It is strong if allowed. Staying in motion does not require constant awareness. It does not need to be monitored closely. It works best when trusted. Trust grows from experience, from seeing that pauses do not erase progress, that uncertainty does not end movement, that you can return again and again. This return is the core skill, not starting, not finishing. Returning after distraction, after doubt, after rest, after difficulty. Each return strengthens the path, makes it easier next time. Eventually, staying in motion stops feeling like a concept and starts feeling like a way of being. You do not announce it, you do not track it, you simply live it. Life remains complex. Challenges remain, but you are no longer standing still, waiting for the right moment. You are already inside the movement of your own life, and that is enough.